Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Flight of Freedom. It's a bit of a different episode today because I wanted to tell you a story. I wanted to tell you a story about a lady we'll call Rachel and about how she's lived in her eating disorder and how recovery and coaching has helped her. So let's find out a little bit about Rachel first. Rachel's life before Julia was a silent monochrome. A world where joy and colour were filtered out by a thick veil of anxiety and control. She lived in a self-imposed prison, the bars constructed from rigid routines and harsh self-criticism. Her morning began not with the chirping of birds or the gentle rays of the sun, but with the dread of facing another day shackled to her rituals. Before her feet would even touch the cool floor, her mind raced with calculations and numbers. The calories to be consumed, the hours to spend in punishing workouts, the constant and obsessive measurements that dictated her worth. Rachel's professional life was a masquerade. She donned a costume of competence and confidence whilst hiding her internal turmoil. As an accountant, her affinity for numbers bled into her personal life, turning her daily existence into a ledger where she meticulously balanced her intake and expenditure of energy and food. Her career success was overshadowed by the exhausting effort to maintain an image of normalcy. Socially, Rachel was isolated. Invitations to dinners or birthdays were met with excuses, as the thought of facing a meal she hadn't planned or prepared herself was terrifying. Friends became distant figures fading into the background of her life, unable to penetrate the wall of her disorder. Laughter and spontaneity were replaced with silence and structure. Her struggles were numerous. Constant hunger gnawed at her. The cold seemed to seep into her bones no matter the weather. The loneliness that came from pushing people away. But above all, it was the mental anguish that weighed the heaviest. Her mind was a battlefield, every thought a confrontation with the enemy of self-doubt and fear. Physical struggles were as present as the mental ones. Each morning her body protested the rigorous exercise regime, her muscles aching, her joints crying out for rest, yet she pushed through, driven by the distorted belief that to relent would be to fail. Even the safety of night brought no respite, as sleep was often elusive, her body too starved of nutrients to find peace in slumber. And when sleep did come, it was fitful and haunted by dreams of food and failure. In this prequel to her transformation, Rachel's life was a constant loop of struggle. Each day was a carbon copy of the last, a groundhog day of restriction and repetition. She lived in a world where her eating disorder was the lens through which all things were viewed, the filter that coloured every experience with shades of guilt and inadequacy. It wasn't until Rachel's path crossed with Julia that the shades began to lift. Julia's empathy, her understanding, and her unwavering support were the keys that unlocked Rachel's prison. It was a slow process, the deconstruction of years of ingrained behaviours and beliefs, but it was a journey that would eventually lead Rachel to a life of colour, freedom, and self-love. A stark contrast to the grayscale existence that once defined her. Let's tell that story now. Rachel's reflection in the mirror was a stranger's. The eyes, once alight with mischief and dreams, now held stories she wasn't sure she wanted to tell. At 53, she was an atlas of where she'd been. Her body, a map of her journeys, but the destinations weren't places you'd pin with stars in a travel brochure. They were the kind that you marked with a sigh and perhaps a tear. Her life had been a silent ballet, a dance with shadows that only she could see. For years, Rachel had twirled in a world that spun on an axis of calories counted and miles run, not hours slept or smiles shared. She was an accountant of a different sort, tallying life in a ledger where the balance never seemed quite right. The kitchen was her battleground, the place where will clashed with want, and every meal was a negotiation. The fridge hummed a tune of temptation, but Rachel had long since stopped dancing to its rhythm. She had her own beat, one of routine, restriction, and control. It was a rhythm that had etched itself into the corners of her home, a metronome that kept time with her heartbeat. But humour, oh, it was her clandestine affair. Rachel found it in the small rebellions, the teaspoon less of almond milk in her coffee, the slight linger in the cookie aisle. She'd chuckle, a soft, almost inaudible sound, a reminder that the girl who loved to laugh hadn't entirely vacated the premises. Then came the day she stumbled upon Julia Trehane. It was a rumble of the digital kind, a misclick on a weary Wednesday that landed her in the lap of Julia's blog. It spoke of freedom and love, words that seemed as foreign as they were alluring. Rachel's finger hovered over the X but paused. Something in Julia's words, a warmth, a knowing, beckoned her to read on. Days turned to weeks, and Rachel found herself returning to Julia's words like a secret rendezvous. There was compassion there, a voice that understood not just the mechanics of an eating disorder, but the marrow of it, the way it could seep into the soul. And so a connection was forged, tenuous at first, like the thread of smoke that might dissipate with the slightest wind. But as Rachel reached out and took that leap of faith to contact Julia, the thread solidified and became a lifeline that pulled her toward a horizon tinged with a colour she hadn't seen in years, the colour of hope. Julia's coaching wasn't a magic wand that banished demons with a flick and a swish. It was a journey they embarked upon together, a path walked with patience and sprinkled with shared laughter at the absurdity of old habits. You know, Julia said one day, perfection is quite a tedious affair. It's like expecting a unicorn to carry your groceries. Delightful, but highly impractical. Rachel had laughed then, a sound that bubbled up from a well she thought had run dry. Together they tackled the myths that had built fortresses in Rachel's mind, myths of worth tied to waistlines, of control equated with success. They unpacked them and held them up to the light, and watched the dust motes dance in the beams as they crumbled. In the safety of Julia's guidance, Rachel began to redefine her relationship with food and her body. She learned to listen, not to the cacophony of diet culture, but to the soft whispers of her own needs. She learned to nourish, not just sustain, to find joy in the swirl of cream in her coffee and the burst of flavour in a ripe strawberry. With each step forwards, Rachel rediscovered pieces of herself. She found the girl who delighted in the scent of old books, who marvelled at the way the sun pointed in the sky in hues of orange and pink. She found the woman who yearned for connection, who craved a life measured not in scales but in moments, deep, rich, and vibrant. It wasn't an overnight transformation. It was a mosaic being pieced together, a tapestry woven from threads of courage, resilience, and an ever-growing love for the woman in the mirror. The stranger became familiar and then beloved. As Rachel's story unfolded, it became less about the dance with the shadows and more about the embrace of light. With Julia's help, she learned that her life was not a silent ballet, but a symphony that deserved to be played out loud in full colour, with an orchestra of experience and a chorus of laughter. And that was only the beginning. The turning point for Rachel wasn't a thunderclap or a momentous occasion draped in fanfare. It was in the mundane, a Tuesday morning softened by the light of a hesitant sun, that she realized she was changing. She was at the supermarket, her list clutched in hand, a scripture of safe foods that had long dictated her life. But today she hesitated. Her gaze lingered on a bunch of ripe bananas, the kind she'd avoided for years, banished for their natural sugars and the fear they evoked. Julia's words echoed in her ears. Fear is the anticipation of a negative future. Eat in the present. And so she reached out and placed the bananas in her cart, a small act of defiance against the regimented routine of her past. At that moment, the grocery list in her hand felt less like a safety net and more like a chain. For the first time in decades, Rachel felt the weight of it and the desire to break free. At home, the bananas sat on the counter, a golden trophy of her courage. She sliced one in her morning cereal, a deliberate sprinkle of bravery atop the usual blandness, and with each bite she tasted something new, a hint of sweetness that was not just from the fruit, but from the victory it represented. As the days unfurled, Julia's coaching sessions became the highlights of Rachel's week. They were virtual meetups that felt more like coffee with an old friend than therapy. Julia had a knack for making recovery feel like an adventure, a quest where each challenge was a dragon to be slayed with laughter as their sword. Rachel began to cook meals that were once forbidden, embracing the sizzle of olive oil in a pan, the aromatic alchemy of herbs and spices. Food was no longer just fuel, it was an experience, a sensory journey she had denied herself for far too long. With Julia's encouragement, Rachel started a journal, not of food or exercises, but of gratitude and self-discovery. She penned her thoughts, her fears, and her triumphs, pouring into the pages the essence of her transformation. Her words were raw, sometimes a trickle of musings, other times a deluge of revelations. And there was humour, always humour. Rachel found herself laughing more at the quirks of her cat, the oddities of life, and the joy of an impromptu dance in her living room to a song from her youth. She began to reclaim the spaces in her home, replacing the scale with books, the workout DVDs with paints and brushes. Her home blossomed into a canvas of her new interests, a reflection of the woman she was becoming. Her relationships changed too. Conversations shifted from diet tips to discussions about dreams and passions. Rachel found herself reconnecting with old friends, repairing bridges she hadn't realized she had burned in her isolation. They noticed the change in her, the lightness in her laugh, the spark in her eyes that spoke of a life reignited. The journey wasn't without its hurdles. Old habits clawed at her, whispering doubts and fears with their insidious voices. But now, Rachel had an arsenal of tools at her disposal, and Julia's unwavering support. She'd learned to navigate these moments, to sit with the discomfort and speak to it with kindness instead of capitulation. Months passed, and the changes in Rachel were no longer just internal. They were etched into the fabric of her life. She volunteered at a local community garden, her hands deep in the earth, connecting with the cycle of growth and renewal. She took up photography, capturing the beauty of the world through a lens of appreciation rather than escape. Rachel's recovery was a tapestry of these moments, each thread a story of its own, woven together in a picture of wellness and self-love. She had faced the darkest parts of herself and come out not just surviving, but thriving. And when Rachel looked in the mirror now, she didn't see the woman she had become. She saw the journey it took to get there, the strength it had built, and the future it promised. She saw hope, she saw life, and most importantly, she saw herself, no longer a stranger, but a friend. The story of Rachel and Julia was one of connection, the transformative power of understanding and support. It was a reminder that recovery, much like life, was not a solo expedition, but a shared voyage. And so Rachel continued to write her own story, and she did so with the knowledge that she was not just a character in it, but the author. As autumn's palettes took over the city, Rachel found herself walking through the park, her strides more confident now, her head held higher than the years when shadows clung to her steps. The crunch of leaves underfoot seemed to be in conversation with her thoughts, a crisp reminder of change and cycles. With each fallen leaf, she contemplated her own seasons of change. The park was once a racetrack, each lap a calculation of calories burned, each breath measured against an invisible ledger of worth. Now, it was a sanctuary where the golden hues of the trees whispered of letting go, and the gentle breeze carried away the remnants of her former constraints. It was here, on a bench engraved with names forgotten by time, that Rachel often sat to read. Today she held a novel about a woman's journey across the globe, a tale of self-discovery that mirrored her own, though the travels were of an internal kind. She read with an appetite she'd once reserved for the hollow promises of diet books. This story's protagonist was fearless, her adventures daring, and it struck a chord within Rachel. With Julia's guidance, she'd embarked on her own daring adventure, one that led her inward to conquer terrains more daunting than any mountain. Her bravery didn't involve crossing deserts or navigating foreign cities. It was in tasting a new dish, embracing a spontaneous outing with friends, and in daring to love herself unconditionally. As winter approaches, the chill in the air brought new challenges. The holiday season was a battlefield strewn with memories of past anxieties and strict rituals. But this year, Rachel was arming herself with new traditions and the warmth of regained friendships. Julia's lessons had become mantras. Holidays are for warmth and joy, not for counting and control, she would say. Rachel prepared Thanksgiving with a recipe for pumpkin pie, a dish she had once labelled forbidden. The kitchen filled with the fragrance of cinnamon and nutmeg, scents that had become the incense of her newfound temple of peace. The dinner table was a mosaic of faces, some old and etched with lines of laughter, some new and bright with a glow of friendship. Rachel served her pie with a side of stories, her laughter rising above the clinking of cutlery. Her friends shared in her joy, their eyes reflecting the flames of candles that danced to the tune of unity and healing. In moments of solitude, Rachel sometimes still found herself grappling with whispers of doubt. They were fainter now, like the last leaves clinging stubbornly to branches. It was in these times she'd reach out to Julia, whose words were like a lighthouse guiding her through foggy thoughts. "You are not your thoughts," Julia would remind her. "You are the sky, vast and unchanging. Thoughts are just clouds passing by." Spring's arrival heralded a renaissance with Rachel. The world around her bloomed, and so did she. The seeds of self-compassion she had planted were now budding into a garden of possibilities. She volunteered to share her story at a local support group, her voice steady and sure as she recounted her journey. Her narrative was punctuated with humour, a recount of a baking fiasco turned into an impromptu art project, or how she once mistook her cat's mischievous antics for a spiritual sign. Laughter bridged the gap between her and the listeners, a reminder that while the pathway of recovery was arduous, it was also littered with moments of unexpected delight. Rachel's life was no longer measured by the scales, the clock, or the mirror. It was in the richness of her day-to-day experiences, in the fulfillment of helping others, and in the simple pleasure of waking up without the heavy shroud of dread. The story of Rachel has many chapters yet unwritten, but one theme remains constant, and that is growth. And as the sun sets on another day, painting the sky with strokes of pink and orange, Rachel knew that her story, one of struggle, triumph, and unyielding hope, was a tale that only she could tell. And it was a tale that was far from over. If you've resonated with Rachel's story, it could be your story. Reach out. Send me a DM. Send me an email. I'm here for you, always. Thank you so much for listening.